poor girl forced to marry a 65-year-old millionaire a week later. His will revealed a shocking truth. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. She was a young woman who never imagined her life could be twisted into a path she had not chosen. Growing up in a modest town, she worked diligently, holding on to the hope that hard effort and honesty could carve out a simple but happy future. Her dreams were small but pure: to have a stable job, a warm little home, and perhaps one day a partner who would cherish her for who she truly was. Yet destiny did not care for such simple wishes. Her family had fallen into a terrible financial trap. Debts mounted quickly, and the cruel hand of poverty wrapped tightly around them. Collectors came often, their demands sharp, their voices cutting through the fragile silence of the household. Her mother's health began to decline under the stress, and her father could no longer find steady work. Every day felt like walking deeper into a dark tunnel without any light in sight. Then came the shocking proposal, one that would change everything. A wealthy man, 65 years old, a millionaire whose name was known across the city, suddenly appeared with an offer. He wanted her hand in marriage. To the world, it seemed like a strange but fortunate turn of events. To her, it was nothing less than a nightmare. She was barely in her 20s, full of life, still clinging to dreams, yet now she was being forced into a bond that felt like a cage. The pressure from her parents was unbearable. "It is the only way to save us," they whispered. Their voices were filled with despair, trembling with fear of losing their home, their dignity, and perhaps even their lives. The young woman sat alone in her room night after night, staring at the peeling paint on the wall, her tears soaking the pillow. She asked herself why fate had chosen her for such a cruel bargain. Was her duty to her family worth the sacrifice of her own future? Could she ever find joy in a marriage that began with chains instead of love? The man himself was powerful, intimidating, and strangely mysterious. Though his age was obvious, his posture still carried the weight of authority. He spoke with calmness, yet there was something unsettling behind his eyes, something she could not quite name. Rumors whispered that his fortune was not just from clever business, but also from hidden dealings and secrets buried beneath polished marble floors and golden chandeliers. When the wedding day arrived, she stood before the mirror, her reflection blurred by tears. The white dress felt like a costume, not a symbol of happiness. Guests gathered in the grand hall, dazzled by the wealth surrounding them, yet unaware of the pain sitting silently in the bride's heart. Each step she took down the aisle echoed like the closing of a heavy door. The applause of strangers sounded like thunder, drowning out her silent screams. As she stood beside her husband, the vows rolling from her lips like heavy stones, she felt the world collapse within her chest. Still, she forced a faint smile, because the survival of her family depended on her obedience. Inside, however, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would endure, but she would never let go of the hope that life could still surprise her. No one at the ceremony knew that only 7 days later, the will of this man would be read aloud, and within its words lay a secret that would turn every assumption upside down. For now, the poor girl was simply a bride against her will, standing at the edge of a story she had never agreed to live. Yet fate had already begun to weave a darker, more dramatic pattern, one that neither she nor the gathered crowd could possibly foresee. Her journey had just begun, and the first page was written not with love, but with sacrifice and despair. The days following the forced wedding passed in a blur of luxury and silence. The young woman, now bound by law and by duty to the 65-year-old millionaire, moved into his grand estate. The mansion was filled with polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and endless corridors that echoed with her footsteps. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a dream come true. But to her, it was a golden prison. Every room reminded her that her freedom had been exchanged for her family's survival. Her husband treated her with a strange formality. He did not raise his voice, nor did he force affection, but his presence weighed heavily upon her. He seemed to observe her quietly, as though measuring every move she made. The servants respected him to the point of fear, lowering their eyes whenever he walked past. She could not understand how a man who owned so much could inspire so little warmth. At night, she sat alone in a lavish bedroom, staring at the ceiling painted with ornate patterns of gold leaf. The bed was large, yet cold, for he rarely entered the room. She wondered if he truly cared for her at all, or if she was merely another pawn in his endless game of power. She tried to remind herself that she had chosen this sacrifice for her parents, yet each passing day made the weight of her decision heavier. Despite her discomfort, her new life introduced her to a world she had never known. Lavish dinners were hosted for businessmen and women of influence. Expensive wines filled glasses that she dared not touch. Conversations drifted around her about deals, stocks, and hidden fortunes. She sat quietly, a ghost at the edge of their world, her heart pounding with the knowledge that she did not belong. More than once, she overheard whispers from the guests. Why such a young bride? What does she really mean to him? Each whisper cut into her like a knife. One evening, after a particularly grand gathering, she found herself wandering into the old library of the mansion. Dust floated in the warm light from the chandelier, and the shelves reached toward the ceiling. There, hidden among the books, she discovered a photograph. It showed her husband as a much younger man, standing beside a woman whose face carried a haunting resemblance to her own. She froze. Who was this woman? And why had her features echoed into her life? She slipped the photograph back into its place, her hands trembling. The following day, her husband invited her to join him in the garden. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane, yet his voice carried surprising strength. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. She wanted to ask who, but the coldness in his gaze silenced her. That night, she could not sleep. Questions circled in her mind, louder than the silence of the mansion. Could it be that her marriage was not only about saving her family from debt, but also about something hidden in his past? Her family visited once during that week. Her mother embraced her tightly, tears falling freely, whispering, "We are safe now, thanks to you." But as her mother left, guilt consumed her. Safe at what cost? She returned to her room, the echo of her mother's gratitude turning into chains around her heart. The days grew longer, filled with a suffocating rhythm. Each sunrise felt like another reminder that she was trapped in a life she had not chosen. Still, within her, a quiet fire burned. She vowed she would not remain powerless. Something inside told her that the millionaire's story was far from simple, and that her role in it was larger than she had been told. On the seventh day, she was summoned to the study. The air was thick, the curtains drawn, and several men in suits stood waiting. Her husband sat at the head of the table, his cane resting beside him, his eyes sharp with authority. The room fell silent as a lawyer opened a folder and prepared to read aloud. Her heart raced as she realized what was about to happen. The will of her husband, written long before their forced union, was about to be revealed. Every servant in the mansion seemed to hold their breath. She clutched her hands tightly together, her mind torn between dread and curiosity. She knew that whatever words would follow could alter everything she thought she knew about her life, her husband, and even the reason she had been chosen to stand at his side. The lawyer cleared his throat, and the first words of the document filled the air, carrying the weight of secrets that had been hidden for decades. The lawyer unfolded the thick document and began to read, his voice steady yet filled with a weight that pressed against the young woman's chest. Every sentence carried echoes of a life she did not know, a past that belonged to the man she had married only 1 week earlier. The millionaire sat still in his chair, his hands resting firmly on the polished wood of the table, his eyes fixed forward as though he already knew the storm about to be unleashed. The will began with formal words about estates, assets, and holdings, but soon it shifted into something far more personal. It spoke of a woman from decades ago, a love lost in tragic circumstances, and of a promise that had never been fulfilled. The young bride felt her pulse quicken as the name of that woman was revealed, for it was the same name she had seen scribbled on the back of the photograph she had discovered in the mansion's library. Her breath caught in her throat. The lawyer continued, revealing that the late woman had once been the great love of the millionaire's youth. They had planned to marry, but fate had torn them apart. Rumors of betrayal and a sudden disappearance had haunted him for years. The millionaire had carried her memory like a shadow, shaping his every decision, driving him to build an empire of wealth and power. But the story did not end there. The will stated that if he were ever to marry again, the bride he chose would inherit not only his fortune but also the secrets tied to his lost love. The young woman trembled in her seat. The resemblance she bore to the woman in the photograph was no longer a coincidence. It was a haunting connection she could not explain. Whispers rose around the room as the men in suits shifted uncomfortably. Her heart pounded as if trying to break free from her chest. Was she chosen not only because of her family's debt, but also because of this strange link to a woman from his past? Her husband finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You now understand why I brought you here," he said, his eyes narrowing. "There are truths you must accept, truths that will bind you to this family's legacy, whether you wish it or not." The young woman wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the weight of the moment silenced her. She thought of her parents, now safe because of her sacrifice. She thought of the photograph, the whispered resemblance, and the will that placed her at the center of a story written long before she was even born. The lawyer pressed on, listing vast estates across the country, offshore accounts, and priceless collections. Yet none of it mattered to her. She was not listening to the numbers or the properties. She was listening for the truth hidden between the lines. She wanted to know why her life had been entangled with this man's destiny. Finally, the will reached its most shocking clause. In the event of his death, the entire fortune would pass not to distant relatives or to charitable foundations, but directly to his legal spouse, the very woman sitting silently in the room. Gasps echoed among the men in suits. Some of them exchanged dark glances, their faces tight with unspoken resentment. The air grew colder as the weight of envy and suspicion filled the space. The young woman's heart thudded in her chest. A week ago, she had been a poor girl trapped by debt. Now, with the reading of a few sentences, she was being thrust into a battle she had never asked for, a struggle over wealth, legacy, and secrets that could destroy everything around her. As the lawyer closed the folder, silence gripped the room. The millionaire rose slowly, leaning on his cane, his eyes never leaving her face. "You see," he said with a faint smile, "this was never just about money. It was about keeping a promise, about finding someone who could carry the weight of what I could not finish." The young woman's thoughts swirled in chaos. Was she living in the shadow of another woman's ghost? Was her husband truly honoring love? Or was he weaving her into an endless web of control and power? She felt the eyes of the men in suits burning into her, their unspoken hostility as sharp as knives. She knew then that danger did not only come from her strange husband but also from those around him who had expected to inherit his empire. That night, as she lay in her room, the mansion felt more like a fortress under siege. Every sound in the corridor seemed suspicious. The weight of the will pressed down on her like a chain. She realized she was now at the center of a storm, trapped between the ghost of a love story from the past and the ruthless greed of men who would stop at nothing to claim what had just been promised to her. Her life had changed again in an instant. The story was no longer just about a forced marriage. It was about survival in a world of secrets, envy, and power. The next step she took would decide not only her own fate, but possibly the fate of the entire fortune that had suddenly fallen into her hands. The revelation of the will did not end with the lawyer's final words. Instead, it opened a new chapter of tension that wrapped itself tightly around the young woman's heart. That night, she sat by the large window in her lavish bedroom, watching the moonlight spill across the garden. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, a face pale with worry, a mind torn apart by questions she could not silence. She pressed her hands together, whispering to herself, "What have I become? Am I truly a wife, or just a shadow of a promise that was never fulfilled?" Her internal conflict grew heavier each day. On one hand, she knew her sacrifice had freed her parents from crushing debt. Their safety gave her strength, reminding her of the reason she had accepted this marriage. On the other hand, the legacy revealed in the will placed her in a world filled with suspicion, envy, and threats. She could sense the resentment of those men in suits who had expected to inherit the fortune. Their eyes during the reading of the will had been filled with hostility. She could almost hear their thoughts whispering, "Why her? Why not us?" The millionaire, her husband, carried himself with an air of calm control, but his silence was its own kind of storm. At breakfast, He would glance at her with unreadable eyes, as if searching for something he could not find. Once, as they sat across from each other at the long dining table, he spoke quietly. "You must be careful," he said, his voice heavy with warning. "Not everyone in this house wishes you well." His words lingered in the air, chilling her more than any winter wind could. She realized she was no longer just a reluctant bride. She was now a target. Her very presence threatened the ambitions of powerful people who had spent years waiting for the fortune to become theirs. That night, she lay awake, her heart pounding as shadows stretched across the walls. Every creak of the floorboards outside her door made her wonder if danger was drawing closer. Days passed, and the tension in the mansion grew sharper. Servants moved nervously, their eyes darting toward her with both pity and fear. She overheard whispers of secret meetings, of plans whispered in the hallways when they thought she was not near. Each whisper added to the storm brewing inside her. She struggled between the urge to run and the duty to endure. Her internal conflict deepened when she returned to the library, desperate to find more clues about the photograph she had discovered. She searched through drawers and cabinets, her fingers trembling as she pulled out faded letters. They were love letters, written decades earlier, filled with longing words and promises of a future that never came. She read each one with growing unease, realizing that her resemblance to the woman in the photograph was more than physical. It was almost as if her life had been woven to continue a story that had been left unfinished. When her husband entered the library unexpectedly, she quickly hid the letters. He looked at her with piercing eyes and said, "You remind me more of her every day." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in the man who otherwise seemed unshakable. But that vulnerability frightened her even more. Was she being loved for who she was, or for the memory of someone who no longer lived? The pressure inside her chest grew unbearable. At night, she questioned herself endlessly. Should she confront him about the truth? Should she demand answers about why she was chosen, why her life was tied to a ghost from the past? Or should she stay silent, protecting her family by enduring the role she had been forced to play? Each option weighed heavily, tearing at her mind until sleep became impossible. Her fears became reality one evening, when she discovered that one of the men in suits had sent a threatening letter slipped under her door. The message was simple, written in sharp ink. "You do not belong here. Leave, or you will regret it." Her hands shook as she read the words, her breath caught in her throat. She realized that the danger she sensed was no longer hidden. It was reaching for her, surrounding her like shadows closing in. Torn between her duty to her family, her fear of the men who despised her, and the strange connection her husband seemed to force upon her, she felt as if her very identity was dissolving. She was no longer the poor girl from a modest town. She was now a woman caught in a web of power, love, envy, and secrets. Her heart longed for freedom, yet every path seemed blocked by walls higher than the mansion itself. As she sat once more by her window, tears streaking her face, she whispered into the darkness, "How long can I endure this life? How long before the truth destroys me, or sets me free?" The night offered no answer, only silence, leaving her to wrestle with the storm inside her own soul. The threatening letter beneath her door marked the beginning of a new nightmare. The young woman clutched the paper in her trembling hands, her heart racing with dread. It was no longer a matter of whispers or hidden resentment. The warning was now clear, written in bold strokes of ink. Someone within the walls of the mansion wanted her gone, and they were not afraid to show it. She pressed the letter to her chest, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. Who had written it? Was it one of the men in suits who had glared at her with envy during the reading of the will? Or perhaps someone even closer, hiding behind the mask of loyalty? She tried to hide the letter, tucking it deep into the drawer of her vanity, but her nerves betrayed her. Every time she walked through the vast halls of the mansion, she felt as though eyes were watching her from every corner. The marble floors echoed her footsteps like a warning drum. Even the servants seemed to avoid her gaze, their silence pressing down on her like a heavy curtain. The once grand estate now felt more like a prison filled with invisible enemies. That evening, during dinner, she dared to glance at her husband. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his sharp eyes did not miss her trembling hands or her uneasy silence. Without raising his voice, He leaned closer across the long table and said, "I told you there are those who do not wish you well. You must be strong. Weakness will destroy you here." His words cut deep, not as comfort but as a chilling reminder of the danger she faced. The young woman's internal struggle became a battlefield. She wanted to ask him if he knew about the letter, if he could protect her, but fear sealed her lips. A part of her wondered if he himself had orchestrated the threat to test her loyalty. After all, his connection to the woman from the photograph haunted every moment of their marriage. Was he protecting her, or was he pushing her into a trap woven with the threads of his own secrets? Late that night, she returned once more to the library, drawn back to the photograph and the letters she had hidden. She read them again under the dim glow of the lamp, searching for answers that only raised more questions. The letters spoke of betrayal, of enemies who had circled the millionaire long before she had entered his life. They hinted at hidden fortunes, at power that reached far beyond the mansion's walls. She realized with growing horror that by marrying him, she had stepped directly into a story of unfinished wars and dangerous rivals. As the days passed, the threats grew bolder. She found the windows of her room slightly open when she was certain she had locked them. Servants began to vanish from their posts without explanation. Once, she caught sight of a shadow moving quickly across the hallway at midnight, disappearing before she could call out. Sleep abandoned her, replaced by endless nights of listening for footsteps outside her door. The breaking point came when another note was slipped onto her pillow while she had stepped out for only a few minutes. This time, the words were darker, colder. "You will never be her. You will never belong here." Her knees buckled as she read it. The truth struck her like a blade. Whoever was tormenting her did not only resent her claim to the fortune, they despised her because she was seen as a pale replacement for the lost woman from her husband's past. Her husband entered the room that evening and found her holding the letter. For the first time, his face betrayed a flicker of anger. He snatched the note from her hand, crumpling it tightly in his fist. "They dare," he muttered, his voice low but filled with fury. He turned toward her, his eyes burning. "This house is filled with snakes, but you must not fear. You are under my protection." The words should have comforted her, yet they only deepened her unease. His protection meant she was bound even tighter to him, locked deeper into his secrets and his control. She wondered if she had exchanged one set of chains for another, if her survival depended not on her own strength but on the whims of a man whose motives she could not trust. Still, a spark of defiance lit within her. She could not allow fear to rule her. She resolved to uncover the truth about the letters, the enemies lurking in the shadows, and the reason she had been chosen for this role she had never desired. Her journey was no longer about mere survival. It was about reclaiming her voice in a world that sought to silence her. As the mansion grew darker with secrets and betrayal, the young woman braced herself for the storm to come. The will had promised her unimaginable wealth, but it had also cursed her with enemies who would stop at nothing to see her fall. The battle lines were drawn, and she knew the next step she took could lead either to her destruction or to the revelation of truths that had been buried for decades. The letter left on her pillow haunted the young woman long after her husband had torn it apart in anger. She could not forget the sharp words that declared she would never belong. Fear lingered, but within her chest another feeling began to rise: defiance. She knew the enemies in the mansion wanted her broken, but she would not give them the satisfaction. The next morning, she carried herself with a quiet strength. At the long dining table, she met her husband's gaze directly for the first time. He studied her carefully, as though he could see the change in her spirit. "Good," he murmured. "You are learning. In this house, only those who refuse to bend can survive." His words were meant as a warning, yet she felt them like a challenge. The men in suits continued their subtle attacks. Their false smiles hid sharp intentions. One brushed past her in the hallway and whispered, "This is not your world." Another stared at her openly during a gathering, his eyes filled with hostility. She no longer shrank back. Instead, she held her ground, though inside her heart pounded with dread. Her strength grew as she began to search for the truth buried in the mansion. Late at night she returned to the library, guided by a desperate need for answers. Behind old ledgers and forgotten drawers, she discovered fragments of the past letters and documents that told a darker story. The woman in the photograph, her husband's lost love, had not simply disappeared. She had been betrayed, trapped in the same world of power and enemies that now surrounded the young bride. The realization shook her, yet it also gave her clarity. She was not chosen only because her family was desperate. She was chosen because her face carried the shadow of another woman. She had been pulled into a legacy of unfinished battles, and whether she wished it or not, her life was now bound to secrets far larger than herself. When her husband noticed the fire in her eyes, he spoke plainly. "You know now, the choice is yours. You can hide, or you can stand. But if you choose to stand, you must be ready for the war that follows." She returned to her room that night with the weight of his words echoing in her mind. She no longer felt like a helpless girl. She was a woman at the edge of truth and danger, forced to decide her own fate. The mansion was filled with enemies, but she whispered to herself, "I will not run. I will endure." The storm had only just begun, and her next step would decide everything. The days following her discovery were filled with an aching silence. Though she carried herself with new determination, inside her heart there was a hollow weight she could not shake. At night, when the mansion grew quiet and the halls echoed only with the sound of her own footsteps, she returned again and again to the papers she had found. Each page revealed more of the betrayal that had stolen her husband's first love, and each line reminded her that she had been drawn into a story that did not belong to her. She stared at her reflection in the tall mirror of her bedroom, the golden frame surrounding a face pale and weary. "Who am I here?" she whispered. "A wife, or only a shadow?" Tears filled her eyes as she admitted to herself that she did not feel loved for who she was. She was trapped between being a savior to her family and a stand-in for a memory she could never replace. The jewels, the marble halls, and the grand title of being his bride felt like nothing more than decorations masking a life of emptiness. Her husband remained distant, watching her quietly at meals, his voice carrying warnings instead of comfort. The men in suits no longer bothered to hide their disdain. Their eyes followed her every move, filled with unspoken threats. Even the servants whispered when she passed, pity in their voices as though they already knew she was doomed. One evening, she walked into the garden under the pale glow of the moon. Surrounded by roses blooming in perfect beauty, she felt the ache of despair rise inside her. She sank to her knees on the gravel path, her sobs shaking her body. "I gave everything," she cried softly. "And still I am nothing." The garden remained silent, offering her no comfort, only the weight of her loneliness. Though her spirit was heavy, a small flame of resolve still flickered. She wiped her tears and pressed her hands together. "I will not let this sorrow erase me," she whispered. The words were fragile, but they were hers. As she returned to her room, the emptiness did not leave her, yet she understood that the fight was far from finished. She was surrounded by enemies and haunted by the past, but she was still breathing, still standing. And though her soul ached with grief, somewhere deep inside she knew that her story was not over. The sorrow that weighed on her heart did not vanish overnight. Yet something within the young woman began to shift. The grief she carried like a stone in her chest slowly turned into fuel. She realized that if she surrendered completely, her enemies would win, and the life she had sacrificed for her family would crumble into nothing. She rose from her despair with a new thought. She must act, not only to protect herself, but also to uncover the full truth that had been hidden inside the mansion for so long. One morning, she entered the dining hall with a different presence. Her steps were steady, her eyes no longer lowered. The men in suits noticed immediately, their murmurs quieting as they sensed her resolve. Even her husband raised his eyebrows slightly, as if surprised by the strength she now carried. She sat at the long table and spoke with calmness. "I know you are watching me. I know what you think. But I will not be broken." Her words silenced the room, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of her own courage. Later that day, she sought out the loyal servants, those who had shown small gestures of kindness in secret. Quietly, she asked them questions, listened to their stories, and began piecing together a clearer picture of the house's dark past. Some told her about secret passages built beneath the estate. Others whispered of old betrayals that had never been punished. Each revelation gave her both fear and strength. She began to see herself not only as a victim, but as someone with the power to reveal the truth. Her husband watched her transformation carefully. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with red and gold, he spoke to her in the garden. "You are stronger than I thought," he admitted. "The woman I once loved could not fight the enemies that surrounded her. Perhaps you can." His words were not gentle, but they lit a spark of pride inside her. For the first time, she began to believe that she was more than a shadow of the past. She was her own person, with her own will. In the nights that followed, she poured her energy into action. She searched the mansion for hidden records, followed whispered trails, and uncovered small but crucial truths. Every discovery made her enemies more restless. The men in suits grew colder in their stares, their hostility sharper. But she no longer shrank back. She walked through the halls with her head held high, determined to face them all. Though fear remained, she carried with her a vision of something better. She dreamed of a future where she could stand freely, no longer bound by chains of wealth or shadows of the past. That dream, fragile but glowing, gave her strength to keep moving forward. She whispered to herself at night, "I am not here to replace anyone. I am here to become myself." Her journey was still tangled in danger, but now she carried both hope and determination. She knew the battles ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine, but she was ready. For the first time since her forced marriage, she felt not only like a survivor, but like a woman who could fight for her own destiny. The storm that had surrounded her life finally began to break. After weeks of fear, sorrow, and defiance, the young woman stood stronger than she had ever believed possible. The mansion was still filled with whispers, the men in suits still burned with envy, but they no longer saw a fragile girl. They saw a woman who had endured every trial and refused to fall. Her husband, once a towering figure of mystery and control, now looked at her with something different in his eyes. Perhaps it was respect, perhaps it was relief, or perhaps it was the recognition that she had become more than a reflection of the woman he had lost. One evening he said quietly, "You have carried more than I had the right to ask of you. Whatever happens after me, you must know this life is yours now." The words settled into her heart, not as chains but as freedom. She understood that the wealth and legacy were not gifts but burdens, yet she no longer feared them. She would use them to build something of her own, something that could not be erased by the shadows of the past. When she walked once more through the gardens, the roses did not mock her despair as they once had. Instead, their beauty reminded her that hope could still grow even in the darkest soil. She thought of her parents, safe and free from debt. She thought of her younger self, the girl who had once dreamed only of a small, peaceful life. Though her path had been filled with sorrow, she had become stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. Her story had begun with sacrifice and despair, but it ended with strength and resolve. She had been forced into a life she did not choose. Yet she emerged with courage and dignity, and in that final moment, she understood that her future, though uncertain, was finally her own.